They thought they were patients, but they were subjects, drugged, reprogrammed, erased. And if your mind could be broken and rebuilt without your consent, how would you ever know? In the shadowy corridors of Cold War paranoia, one project emerged that would blur the lines between science, secrecy, and control. Its name was MKUltra. Launched by the CIA in the early 1950s, MKUltra was a classified program designed to explore mind control, interrogation resistance, and behavioral manipulation. At its core, it posed a chilling question. Could a person's thoughts be controlled without their knowledge? Over the span of 2 decades, the project evolved into a sprawling web of over 150 sub-projects, carried out in hospitals, prisons, military facilities, and even unsuspecting universities across the United States and Canada. The experiments involved hallucinogens like LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy. Some test subjects volunteered. Others never knew they were part of anything at all. One of the most infamous cases took place at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, where psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron's patients were subjected to psychic driving, a process of drug-induced comas, repeated messages, and memory erasure. Intended to break down the human mind and rebuild it from scratch, the results were catastrophic. Lives were shattered, identities erased. The program remained hidden from public knowledge until the 1970s, when a series of investigations and leaked documents began to expose the scale and ethical violations of MKUltra. Yet much of the evidence was destroyed in 1973 on CIA orders. To this day, how far the experiments went, and whether their findings were ever fully abandoned, remains a matter of speculation. The records may be gone, but the shadow of MKUltra continues to raise one enduring question. If minds can be manipulated, who truly controls the truth? It began in 1932 with a promise of free medical care, but what unfolded over the next 4 decades would become one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. In Macon County, Alabama, the U.S. Public Health Service launched what it called the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. 600 African American men were enrolled, 399 of them with syphilis, 201 without. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe a range of ailments. In truth, they were being observed, not cured. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, the researchers deliberately withheld it. The goal? To watch the natural progression of the disease. Subjects were monitored as their bodies and lives deteriorated. Many went blind, insane, or died. Wives were infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. All while the men remained unaware of what was truly happening to them. The study continued for 40 years, until it was exposed by a whistleblower in 1972. Public outrage followed. Congressional hearings were held. And eventually, in 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. The Tuskegee syphilis study wasn't just a medical failure, it was a moral one. It eroded trust in public health and raised enduring questions about ethics, race, and consent. And though the study has ended, its legacy lingers in every medical form that requires informed consent, and in every community still questioning whether science serves all people equally. In the frozen outskirts of Harbin, Manchuria, during the 1930s and 40s, a covert complex operated under a deceptively simple name, Unit 731. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Imperial Japanese Army. In truth, it was a site of some of the most horrific human experimentation ever conducted. Led by General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 served as a biological warfare research facility. Within its walls, thousands of men, women, and children, primarily Chinese civilians, but also Koreans, Russians, and Allied prisoners, were subjected to brutal and often fatal experiments. The subjects, known coldly as Maryuta, meaning logs, were exposed to diseases such as anthrax, plague, and cholera. Limbs were amputated without anesthesia. Bodies were dissected alive to study organ failure in real time. Outside the lab, entire villages were infected to test the spread of contagion. Fleas carrying plague were dropped from planes. Wells were poisoned, and all of it meticulously recorded in the name of science and war. When World War II ended, the horrors of Unit 731 might have come to light in an international tribunal. But instead, many of its top scientists, including Ishii himself, were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. The complex was burned to the ground. The bodies were buried or lost. But the testimony of survivors and former personnel would eventually reveal the full scale of the atrocities. To this day, no one from Unit 731 has been tried in a court of law. And the question lingers, quietly unsettling. What is the true cost of scientific progress when it's pursued without humanity? Before MKUltra became the face of America's mind control experiments, there was another, more secretive program known simply as Project Artichoke. Launched by the CIA in 1951, Artichoke was a classified effort to explore how far the human mind could be pushed and broken. The project asked a chilling question. Could someone be controlled to perform acts like assassination against their will and with no memory afterward? To find the answer, CIA operatives turned to a cocktail of methods: hypnosis, psychological coercion, isolation, sensory deprivation, and most infamously, drugs. Subjects were dosed with LSD, barbiturates, and heroin, often in combination, to see how their thoughts, behaviors, and allegiances could be manipulated. Many test subjects were prisoners, mental patients, or suspected foreign agents, people who had no idea what was being done to them. One experiment involved alternating sedatives and stimulants during interrogations to destabilize a subject's sense of time and reality. In others, hypnosis was used to try implanting false memories or commands. There were even tests involving forced addiction and withdrawal to observe how desperation could shape loyalty. Despite years of experimentation, results remained ambiguous. But Project Artichoke laid the groundwork for even larger efforts, eventually morphing into the infamous MKUltra program. Today, most records related to Artichoke remain heavily redacted or destroyed. And while the project officially ended in the mid-1950s, its unanswered questions continue to haunt intelligence historians. How much control can one mind exert over another? And if the boundaries were crossed, who remembers where they once stood? In the aftermath of World War II, as the dust of conflict settled over Europe, a new race began, not for territory, but for minds. It was called Operation Paperclip, spearheaded by the U.S. Office of Strategic Services. Later, the CIA, Operation Paperclip was a covert mission to recruit over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. Many had worked directly for the Nazi regime. Some were members of the SS. Others had been deeply involved in weapons development, human experimentation, and propaganda. But the United States had one goal: prevent this knowledge from falling into Soviet hands. Among the most prominent recruits was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, a weapon that had rained destruction on London, but also became the foundation for NASA's Saturn V. With his help, America would win the space race. But behind that achievement lay an uncomfortable truth. Many of these scientists had ties to atrocities committed during the war. At least 21 were investigated for war crimes, though none were prosecuted. Their files were rewritten, records sanitized, past affiliations quietly omitted. The need for technological superiority, especially in rocketry, aviation, and chemical warfare, outweighed moral concerns. For decades, the details of Operation Paperclip remained buried in classified archives. But as documents emerged, so did difficult questions. Can justice and pragmatism coexist in a world built on secrets? Even now, the legacy of Operation Paperclip lingers, not just in spacecraft and laboratories, but in the uneasy silence between innovation and accountability. In the quiet halls of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a series of experiments unfolded in the 1950s and 60s, led by a respected psychiatrist, Dr. Ewan Cameron. Officially, these were treatments for mental illness. In reality, they became one of the most disturbing branches of the CIA's covert MKUltra program. Cameron's work centered around a method he called psychic driving. The goal was to break down a patient's mind entirely and then rebuild it from the ground up. His patients, many suffering from anxiety or depression, were unknowingly subjected to weeks of drug-induced comas, extreme electroconvulsive therapy, and endless looping audio messages. The messages were sometimes played up to 500,000 times, intended to reprogram the subconscious. Subjects were also given massive doses of LSD and other experimental drugs, without their knowledge or consent. Memory loss, identity confusion, and permanent psychological damage were common outcomes. Some patients forgot who they were. Others lost the ability to speak, read, or recognize loved ones. These experiments were secretly funded by the CIA through front organizations, part of their broader effort to explore mind control. The victims had no idea they were participating in a U.S. intelligence project. It would take decades for the truth to surface. Some victims and families would later receive compensation, but no formal apology was ever issued by the U.S. government. To this day, the Montreal experiments remain a haunting reminder. When institutions pursue control under the guise of care, who protects the minds of the vulnerable? During the height of the Cold War, deep within the corridors of U.S. military intelligence, a strange question was being asked in complete seriousness. Could the human mind transcend space and gather secrets from afar, using nothing but thought? The answer, they hoped, lay within Project Stargate. Launched in the early 1970s and funded for over 2 decades, Project Stargate was the U.S. government's attempt to weaponize remote viewing, the alleged psychic ability to see distant locations, objects, or events without any physical connection. What began at the Stanford Research Institute soon evolved into a program involving Army personnel, CIA handlers, and civilian psychics. Participants were placed in shielded rooms, given a set of coordinates or vague target descriptions, and asked to sketch or describe what they saw. Targets included secret Soviet bases, hostages in Lebanon, and even hidden nuclear facilities. Surprisingly, some results seemed uncannily accurate. Other sessions, however, yielded only confusion or abstract imagery. The CIA, DIA, and Army each took turns managing the project, which shifted names several times: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, before being consolidated as Project Stargate. After years of classified testing, the program was quietly shut down in 1995, with official reports labeling it unreliable. Yet many insiders claimed the data was downplayed, too unconventional, too unpredictable, but perhaps too promising to ignore entirely. Was Stargate a misguided journey into pseudoscience, or a glimpse into untapped potential of the human mind? The documents have been declassified. The program is over. But the question still lingers. If thoughts can travel beyond space, how far have they already gone? In 1962, at the peak of Cold War tension, a chilling proposal crossed the desk of U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. It came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it was called Operation Northwoods. The plan was startling in its boldness and disturbing in its intent. To justify a military invasion of Cuba, U.S. officials proposed carrying out false flag attacks, not against enemy forces, but against their own citizens. Ideas included hijacking or crashing American airliners, staging fake terrorist attacks in U.S. cities, sinking refugee boats, and blaming the incidents on Fidel Castro's government. The logic was coldly strategic: create public outrage, spark media frenzy, and build support for a full-scale war against Cuba. The authors even suggested using controlled explosions and fabricated evidence to implicate Cuban operatives. But there was a limit, even in the secretive halls of power. When the proposal reached President John F. Kennedy, it was immediately rejected. Soon after, General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was removed from his position. For decades, Operation Northwoods remained hidden, buried deep in classified archives. It wasn't until the late 1990s, through declassified documents, that the American public learned how close their government had come to fabricating an international crisis. The plan was never executed, but its existence raises a sobering question. In the pursuit of strategic advantage, how thin is the line between defense and deception? In the murky world of Cold War intelligence, information was as powerful as any weapon, and the CIA wanted to control it. Deep within its classified files lay an operation that blurred the line between journalism and espionage. It was called Operation Mockingbird. Allegedly launched in the late 1940s under the direction of CIA official Frank Wisner, Operation Mockingbird was designed to infiltrate and influence major news organizations. Its mission, to shape public opinion, suppress inconvenient truths, and quietly promote narratives that served U.S. interests, both at home and abroad. According to declassified documents and congressional testimony from the 1970s Church Committee hearings, the CIA had recruited journalists from major outlets like the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, and CBS. Some were paid informants. Others cooperated willingly, believing they were serving national security. Through these media channels, the CIA could plant stories, leak selective intelligence, or obscure foreign interventions under a veil of credibility. In some cases, reporters were sent overseas not just to cover events, but to influence them. The full extent of the operation remains debated. Some claim it ended in the 1970s following public exposure. Others argue its tactics evolved rather than disappeared. What's clear is this: in a democracy, where truth is meant to keep power in check, the quiet manipulation of information has lasting consequences. And it leaves behind an unsettling question. When the story you're reading serves someone else's agenda, how would you ever know? Tucked away in the forests of Maryland, Edgewood Arsenal looked like just another military research facility. But behind its secured gates, a decades-long series of human experiments unfolded, quietly sanctioned, and largely hidden from public view. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the U.S. Army conducted over 7,000 classified experiments on volunteer soldiers at Edgewood. The goal: to test the effects of chemical and biological agents on human physiology and behavior. Among the substances administered were nerve agents like VX and sarin, hallucinogens such as LSD and BZ, and experimental incapacitating chemicals whose full effects were barely understood. The soldiers, mostly young, healthy recruits, were told they were helping with national defense research. What many didn't know was that they were being exposed to substances designed to disrupt the mind, paralyze the body, or simulate conditions of chemical warfare. Some experienced terrifying hallucinations. Others suffered memory loss, neurological damage, or long-term psychological trauma. The experiments aimed to explore everything from non-lethal battlefield control to interrogation enhancement. But ethical boundaries were thin, and informed consent was often vague or non-existent. In the decades that followed, many former test subjects came forward, demanding answers, medical help, and recognition. Government investigations acknowledged the experiments, but little restitution was offered. Edgewood Arsenal was not a battlefield, but for thousands, it became a place where the human body was tested like a weapon, and the long-term consequences were treated as a footnote. And even now, as more documents come to light, one question remains unanswered. How many secrets still lie buried in the name of national security? Set amid the rolling countryside of Wiltshire, England, Porton Down is one of the oldest and most secretive military science facilities in the world. Officially tasked with defending the UK against chemical and biological threats, it has also been the site of decades of classified human trials, many of which are only now coming to light. From the 1940s onward, thousands of British servicemen were recruited, often without full understanding, to participate in tests involving nerve agents, mustard gas, hallucinogens, and psychoactive drugs. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 1953, when 20-year-old airman Ronald Madison died shortly after being exposed to sarin gas during what was described as a routine test. At the time, his death was shrouded in secrecy, and the true cause remained classified for nearly 50 years. Volunteers were told the experiments were safe. Many believed they were helping their country. In reality, they were often exposed to substances capable of disabling or killing within minutes. The trials included exposure to LSD, CS gas, and even exotic agents whose effects were poorly understood. Long-term health impacts were largely undocumented. Some veterans would later report neurological issues, memory problems, and unexplained illnesses. Investigations in the 21st century revealed ethical breaches, a lack of proper consent, and institutional indifference toward the human cost. Portondown continues to operate today, now focused on defense and disease research. But its past casts a long shadow, one that raises an enduring ethical dilemma. When a government asks its own citizens to risk their minds and bodies for science, where should the line be drawn? In the late 1940s, under the banner of public health research, a disturbing experiment unfolded far from American soil, quietly sanctioned and carefully concealed. It would remain hidden for more than 60 years. Its name, the Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. government researchers, working in partnership with Guatemalan authorities, intentionally infected over 1,300 Guatemalan citizens with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. The subjects included soldiers, prisoners, mental health patients, and even children in orphanages. Many were never told they were part of a study. Fewer still gave anything resembling informed consent. The stated purpose was to test the effectiveness of penicillin as a treatment and preventative measure. But the methods were deeply unethical. In some cases, sex workers carrying the disease were instructed to sleep with subjects. In others, researchers applied infected material directly to wounds or body parts. Although some participants received treatment, many were left untreated, observed instead as the diseases progressed. The long-term consequences were devastating: chronic illness, mental deterioration, and death, all carried out under the supervision of U.S. health officials. The experiments were never publicly acknowledged until 2010, when a medical historian uncovered archived records. The U.S. government issued a formal apology soon after, calling the experiments clearly unethical and reprehensible. But no compensation was provided to the victims or their families. The Guatemala syphilis experiments remain a stark reminder. When the vulnerable are used as tools in the name of science, who ensures that humanity, not just data, is preserved? In September 1950, without warning or public knowledge, the U.S. Navy conducted a covert experiment on the unsuspecting citizens of San Francisco. The mission was known as Operation Sea Spray, a real-world test of biological warfare preparedness that would later raise serious ethical and medical concerns. Over the course of several days, naval ships off the coast released a fine mist into the air, containing Serratia marcescens, a bacterium chosen for its visibility and presumed harmlessness. The goal: to simulate a biological attack and measure how quickly and widely the particles would disperse in a major American city. The results were alarming. The bacteria spread through the air and water systems, reaching tens of thousands of residents. Within days, local hospitals reported an unusual spike in rare infections. One man, Edward Nevin, died from a Serratia-related infection, a condition his family believes was directly caused by the experiment. At the time, the public was told nothing. The test remained classified for decades, only coming to light in the 1970s during congressional investigations into Cold War-era military programs. It was then revealed that San Francisco was not the only city. Dozens of other U.S. locations were similarly exposed to biological agents in secret. Though the military insisted the bacteria were non-lethal, modern studies suggest otherwise, particularly for the elderly, ill, or immunocompromised. Operation Sea Spray may have been a test of vulnerability, but in doing so, it revealed something deeper. When national defense is prioritized over public consent, the line between protection and betrayal becomes dangerously thin. Behind a nondescript door in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood, something strange was happening in the 1950s. The curtains were drawn, a microphone was hidden in the wall, and from behind a two-way mirror, CIA operatives were watching. This was Operation Midnight Climax, one of the most surreal and ethically dubious chapters of the MKUltra program. At first glance, the setup resembled something out of a noir film. The CIA leased safe houses and furnished them with hidden surveillance equipment. Prostitutes, recruited and paid by the agency, lured unsuspecting men back to the apartments, where drinks were secretly laced with LSD. As the drug took effect, agents observed and recorded the men's behavior, searching for insight into how truth could be extracted or how judgment could be manipulated. The test subjects never gave consent. They were chosen precisely because no one would believe their stories if they ever spoke up. Operation Midnight Climax ran for nearly a decade, not only in San Francisco but also in New York. Over time, the experiments grew less controlled and more chaotic. Some CIA agents reportedly used the safe houses for personal pleasure and deviated from any scientific protocol altogether. Officially, the program was shut down in the mid-1960s. But like much of MKUltra, the full scope of what happened remains uncertain. Many records were destroyed, many questions unanswered. In the end, Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just an experiment in mind control. It was a disturbing study in power, secrecy, and what happens when moral boundaries are erased behind closed doors. And it leaves us wondering, how much do we really know about what our governments are willing to do in the name of control? In the hidden rooms of rented apartments across San Francisco and New York City, the CIA conducted experiments that blurred the line between science and surveillance. These were the LSD safehouse experiments, covert operations that served as a core part of MKUltra, the agency's secret mind control program. Beginning in the early 1950s, the CIA sought to understand how LSD and other psychoactive substances could be used in interrogation, behavior modification, and psychological warfare. To test these effects in real-world scenarios, the agency created a series of safe houses, ordinary-looking apartments wired with two-way mirrors, hidden microphones, and recording devices. There, unsuspecting civilians were drugged with LSD, sometimes slipped into cocktails, sometimes inhaled as a vapor. Most of them had no idea they were part of an experiment. CIA agents observed from behind the glass, documenting every reaction. Confusion, paranoia, compliance, resistance. It was all recorded in the name of science, but conducted without consent. Some subjects were chosen because they were unlikely to report what had happened. Others were lured in by sex workers recruited by the agency, further complicating the ethics of the operation. In these rooms, the CIA wasn't just testing a drug, it was testing the limits of secrecy, manipulation, and control. The experiments lasted for years. Many of the records were destroyed in the 1970s, leaving behind only fragments and testimonies. Today, the safe houses are gone, but their legacy endures as a troubling reminder. When government experiments are carried out in silence, who speaks for those who never even knew they were subjects? Before MKUltra became a household name, the CIA's journey into the dark science of mind control began with a lesser-known, but equally unsettling program, Project Bluebird. Launched in 1950, at the dawn of the Cold War, Project Bluebird was the CIA's first formal attempt to explore behavioral modification, memory erasure, and interrogation resistance. Fueled by fears that foreign powers were using hypnosis and drugs to brainwash captured soldiers, the U.S. intelligence community began asking its own disturbing questions. Could the human mind be broken and reprogrammed? The experiments were wide-ranging. CIA researchers tested barbiturates, amphetamines, LSD, and other psychoactive substances to see how they affected memory, suggestibility, and resistance to interrogation. Subjects were often military personnel, prisoners, or psychiatric patients. Hypnosis was also used, both alone and in combination with drugs, in efforts to create amnesia, implant false memories, or trigger unconscious behavior on command. One of the project's key goals was to develop a method to control a person without their awareness, to create what was chillingly referred to as a hypnotic courier, someone who could carry sensitive information or perform a task without knowing they were doing so. In 1951, Project Bluebird was renamed Project Artichoke, expanding its scope even further. Most details remained classified for decades. What little survives in the public record paints a disturbing picture, not just of secret science, but of how quickly ethical boundaries can vanish in the fog of national security. And with so much still redacted or destroyed, we're left to wonder, what exactly was discovered in those early years, and how much of it was ever truly abandoned? In the final years of World War II and into the early Cold War, the United States Navy launched a quiet but deeply curious operation, Project Chatter. Its aim was simple in theory, yet deeply unsettling in practice. Could drugs compel a person to talk? Initiated in 1947, Project Chatter was one of the earliest U.S. efforts to investigate chemical means of extracting information from unwilling subjects. At a time when fears of Soviet mind control and espionage were growing, the Navy sought substances that could weaken resistance, lower inhibitions, or force truthfulness during interrogations. Among the compounds tested were scopolamine, mescaline, and LSD, each believed to have potential for truth serum properties. Human subjects included military personnel, suspected spies, and psychiatric patients. Some volunteered. Others likely didn't know what they were consenting to. The results were inconsistent. While some drugs made subjects more talkative or confused, they also produced hallucinations, memory disruption, and psychological distress, effects that made the data unreliable, even dangerous. By 1953, Project Chatter was officially shut down. But its findings and methods would directly feed into the CIA's more ambitious mind control programs, Project Bluebird, Artichoke, and eventually MKUltra. Though often overlooked, Project Chatter marked a critical turning point, the moment when the U.S. government moved from physical coercion to chemical manipulation in the name of national security. And it leaves behind a sobering realization. Before mind control became a science fiction fear, it was already a military experiment, one dose at a time. Hidden beneath layers of Cold War secrecy, Project Naomi stood at the crossroads of biology, espionage, and covert warfare. Born out of growing anxieties about chemical and biological attacks, it was one of the U.S. government's most secretive and compartmentalized programs. Initiated in the 1950s, Project Naomi was a joint effort between the CIA and the U.S. Army Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Its mission, to research, develop, and store biological agents, not just for defense, but for possible offensive use in covert operations. These included toxins, pathogens, and delivery mechanisms that could incapacitate or kill, often without leaving a trace. The project wasn't confined to the lab. Naomi's scope included testing disguised poisons, aerosol dispersal systems, and even the use of animals and insects as vectors of disease. Special emphasis was placed on creating untraceable weapons, tools that could be used for political assassinations or sabotage without international detection. One of its alleged links includes the mysterious case of Frank Olson, a Fort Detrick scientist who fell, or was pushed, from a hotel window in 1953 after being dosed with LSD during a related MKUltra experiment. Some believe Olson's knowledge of Naomi's darker capabilities may have sealed his fate. Officially, Project Naomi was terminated in the early 1970s, but the full extent of its activities remains shrouded in redactions and missing files. What little we do know is chilling. A program designed to turn biology into a weapon, quietly developed under the radar of public scrutiny. And it leaves one final, unsettling thought. In the realm of silent warfare, is the deadliest weapon the one no one ever sees? In March 1968, a quiet valley in Skull Valley, Utah, became the site of a mysterious and devastating event, one that would expose the hidden dangers of America's chemical weapons testing. It's known today as the Dugway Sheep Incident. Over the course of a single day, nearly 6,000 sheep were found dead, scattered across ranches near the Dugway Proving Ground, a vast military facility used for testing biological and chemical warfare agents. The deaths were sudden. The symptoms, frothing at the mouth, respiratory failure, were immediate and grim. Ranchers, baffled and alarmed, suspected something unnatural. 4 weeks, the U.S. Army denied responsibility. But as environmental samples were tested, a chilling truth emerged. The sheep had been exposed to VX nerve agent, one of the deadliest chemical weapons ever developed. The Dugway facility had conducted an open-air test of VX just hours before the deaths, releasing it from aircraft into the desert atmosphere. Though officials claimed the exposure was accidental, likely the result of wind drift or improper containment, the incident raised alarming questions about the safety and ethics of chemical weapons testing on U.S. soil. In time, the Army quietly paid compensation to the ranchers, but never officially accepted full responsibility. The incident remained classified for years, part of a larger pattern of secrecy surrounding Cold War-era weapons programs. Today, the Dugway sheep incident stands as a stark reminder of the hidden costs of military experimentation, and a haunting question lingers in the air. If thousands of sheep could die in one night, what might have happened if the wind had simply blown the other way? In the spring of 1955, the skies over Savannah, Georgia, held an unusual cargo. Not bombs or chemicals, but hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes. This was not an accident. It was a military test known as Operation Big Buzz, a chilling exercise in entomological warfare. Conducted by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, the goal of Operation Big Buzz was to determine whether disease-carrying insects could be used as biological weapons. For this test, Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, known vectors of yellow fever and dengue, were bred in massive numbers, placed into munitions, and released from aircraft over civilian areas. Though the mosquitoes used in the operation were not infected with disease, the implications were unsettling. Once dropped, they spread quickly, entered homes, bit residents, and proved their ability to survive and seek out human hosts. The data gathered confirmed what the military wanted to know. Insects could be delivered by air and remain viable as weapons. No public warning was given. The population of Savannah remained unaware that they were part of a military experiment involving thousands of live, blood-seeking insects. Operation Big Buzz was just one of several entomological tests conducted during the Cold War. Later operations like Big Itch and Drop Kick expanded the concept further. Today, the very idea sounds like science fiction. Weaponized mosquitoes raining from the sky. But it was real. It was tested. And it was kept secret for decades. And it leaves behind a disturbing question. If mosquitoes could be engineered as weapons, how many other forms of life have been quietly considered tools of war? In a quiet wing of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal during the 1950s and 60s, patients checked in for treatment, but many never fully recovered. Under the care of world-renowned psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, they unknowingly became test subjects in one of the darkest chapters of MKUltra, Subproject 68. Funded covertly by the CIA, Subproject 68 was intended to explore psychic driving, a radical method Cameron believed could erase and rebuild the human mind. The theory was simple yet extreme. First, break down the patient's psyche through high-dose electroshock therapy, drug-induced comas, and sensory deprivation. Then, reprogram their behavior using looped audio messages, played for hours or even days. Patients suffering from depression, anxiety, or minor trauma were subjected to weeks or months of relentless treatment. Some received 20 to 40 times the standard intensity of electroshock, followed by barbiturate-induced sleep lasting weeks. In that vulnerable state, messages like, "You are a good wife," or "You trust your doctor" were played repeatedly, intended to overwrite their consciousness. The results were devastating. Many patients emerged with wiped memories, lost speech, and fractured identities. Few were told they were part of an experiment. None gave informed consent. When details of Subproject 68 were revealed decades later, they sent shockwaves through both the psychiatric and intelligence communities. Legal battles followed, but most victims never saw justice. Today, Subproject 68 stands as a grim reminder of what happens when science, secrecy, and control converge unchecked. And it leaves us with a haunting question. If minds can be broken and rebuilt by force, who decides what should be put back in their place?